let's break down the criminal justice system in America, and by extension, many Western and other countries. So the first thing to look at is that we spend roughly $100,000 a year to take largely men and largely racial minority men, black men, and put them in concrete boxes for $100,000 a year. And roughly 2% of the United States population is in some process involved in the criminal system or the criminal justice system. And so we could say that we are spending somewhere between $100,000 and $250,000 per group of 100 people. So if you have a neighborhood of 100 people, our system creates criminals, first of all, because first you have to raise people that want to and are willing and commit a crime, and then locks them up in punitive boxes of one form or another to the tune of $250,000 a year. So let's break this down. So the first thing is that our model of justice is that if you break this law, we will cause you to suffer. And this is the first flaw, because the first thing to do is to make sure that every law on the books actually prevents people harming one another. Because, and this gets rid of a lot of things like, gay sex in still some states and in some countries, which is not hurting anyone. So the first thing to do is to establish that every law that is on the books not only prevents hurting other people, but that the existence of the law does not hurt more people or hurt people more than the hurt caused if the law doesn't exist and the behavior persists. So that's the first thing, is to understand that all laws have to be data-oriented in order to prevent unnecessary suffering, that's the purpose of the law. The second thing is to shift away from punishment, i.e., you caused this person or this community to suffer, therefore we are going to cause you to suffer. More importantly, we are going to suffer more to cause you to suffer, because who has to suffer the $100,000 bill to put someone in a concrete box? Everyone does. So we have a system that says that if you make us suffer, we will volunteer to suffer more so that we can make you suffer, and then everything will be right with the world. And so the first and most important thing is to shift from a punitive to a repair or to a healing paradigm. And what this means is that if you steal $75 from the local Walgreens, that you pay back $500 to that local Walgreens, that you give back with interest what you took. So the shifting goes from one of mutual punishment to violation and restoration of the violation. And so this is a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift. The second thing to understand about the American criminal justice system is that it is heavily weighted and biased based on race, based on income, and based on appearance in areas that have nothing to do with the issue. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Talking with Strangers, did a chapter on who gets bail in America. And it's generally well-spoken, contrite white people, regardless of their prior history, get bail, and other people do not. And a computer system does a better job of determining who's likely to commit a violent crime. And so the next thing on a racial level is if we're locking up 1 in 4 African American youth, or whatever the statistic is at the moment, and we're going to spend $100,000 a year of public money to ruin a person's life and take them out of circulation. Let's start with a shift. Let's start with acknowledging that hundreds of years of slavery and racism and racial injustice does harm economically, socially, and otherwise to a people. And let's make $50,000 to $100,000 available as a per-child investment for every African American, that sometime between the age of 16 and 25, that every African American citizen can apply for a guaranteed $50,000 to $100,000 investment in their future. Now, some of this can be available to therapists, paid directly to therapists if therapy is needed. Some of it can be investment in education, and some of it can be investment in a business. And so, depending on the competency of use, each individual can be guaranteed a minimum of $50,000 of capital to invest in their future. And the only thing that the individual has to do, doesn't matter about criminal record, doesn't matter about education level, the only thing that the individual has to do is show a reasonable odds that the money invested is going to significantly pay off in their future. So this could be investing in a retirement fund. What a great thing to start off with $50,000 invested in a retirement fund that you can't pull out, but that you've got a retirement fund with that's likely to make you financially independent by the time you're 60. It could be in an entrepreneurial business venture, again, that has a reasonable chance of paying off in partnership with a mentor. So you get a mentor and investment in your small business, or in education, in a skill that is likely to develop career competency. Not a liberal arts degree, not a university. No, a specific set of courses that empower you to do well in that field, in a field that needs work. So this $50,000 to $100,000 investment, even if half of it goes to waste, is 100% better than 100% of it going to waste, which it does by putting people in concrete boxes for just 1 year. It gives hope it speaks to the righting of an imbalance when you enslave people and treat them like animals for hundreds of years. It has impact. And so acknowledging that impact and saying, here's a boost, you have a disproportionate advantage, because we're not going to guarantee this for Caucasians. You have a disproportionate advantage to invest in your future and in your community. See, now we're turning liabilities into assets while saving 50% on the dollar. Because what we're doing with that, let's say for the 50% that is wasted, a lot of entrepreneurs lose in their first business. So let's say it's an elaborate process of losing, and you come out the other side and you learn what to do better. Well, now you've got a more educated human being. And plus, all of that money is being spent in the community. If you start a business and you're renting a shop front, and then 2 years later your business goes bankrupt because you didn't learn how to start a business properly. Well, the community has gotten 2 years of lease money for that shop front. The community has got the advantage of another business. And even if the business went under, perhaps because the prices were too low, etc., people got a job. So that money was going into the vital area of the economy rather than becoming, going into the prison system. So next we look at another issue around U.S. prisons. The movie Teens for Cash, in which corrupt individuals were paid bribes to sentence teenagers for very small infractions into for-profit prison systems. The ways that states guarantee quotas to for-profit prison systems reveal the fact that when you have a capitalist framework that rewards a small group of people for the suffering of a large group of people, that the entire system is faulty. You don't want anyone to be in prison. What you really want to do is to prevent crime. So if we've got, let's say, $250,000 per group of 100 individuals that is currently being spent in one way or another to punish crime and to deter crime, the next thing to look at is the fact that every human being in the history of humanity has wanted to feel sustainably good, has wanted to increase their well-being, and wanted to avoid unnecessary suffering. Now, one of the biggest areas of suffering is social sanction. And so one of the things to look at in the age of Facebook and web pages, etc., is that people might, from an avoiding suffering perspective, people might be more responsive to an impact rating on Facebook and on their business web page, on their social media basically, to show the amount of harm they have caused other people in the community and the amount of good they have caused in the community. So what's the benefit of this? Well, if people are self-motivated to feel good and avoid feeling bad, and if every person in the history of the planet relates in some way to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, survival, security, then level 3 is love and belonging, and level 4 is self-esteem. Love and belonging and self-esteem. Now, both love and belonging and self-esteem, level 3 and level 4 in the hierarchy of needs, you want to look good so that you can be more loved, so that you can be more accepted, so you can belong more. Because groups invariably cast out people who they attribute to the suffering of the group. And so a social impact rating that is part of every person's digital media account could be more effective than prisons at creating a deterrent of crime. It may be, for example, if you understand which traffic infractions are actually causing the most deaths in the community, and those are ranked higher, and this, see, one of the things this does is it bypasses the other aspect of corruption in the U.S. justice system, justice being in quotes, by taking money out of it. It is an absolute fact that if you are a billionaire in the United States, or you are homeless, that the quality of justice you receive is thousands of % different. We're not just talking 10%, whatever. We're talking thousands of %. Buying juries, buying judges, buying protest, buying public opinion, buying influence of the jury. You have so much corruption in the justice system based solely on money. And when it comes to paying a speeding ticket or whatever it is, it's easy for a billionaire. It's easy for a billionaire to pay that off. But social media, everyone wants to look good and doesn't want to look bad. So if the impacts, the negative impacts, are equally applied on a social media ranking, where you can get, an A+++, a gold star, a platinum, that you've had a profoundly positive impact on your community. And it can go through the impact, the footprint that you've had in categories that range from having a profoundly positive impact on your community to profoundly negative impact on your community. And we currently have a Forbes 400 list and a Fortune 500 list for measuring money. We are, in a sense, saying that the money that people make is more important than the people who make it, because there is no Fortune 500 list, there's no Forbes 400 list for the best parents in the country, for the best teachers in the country, for the most contributive black youth in the country, for the most dynamic teenagers in the country who bring positive impact to the homeless. We have no ranking system for almost anything of value other than money. And this makes sense in a capitalist cult rather than a humanist cult. We have just a very few places that measure human well-being. One country in the world that measures human happiness as its primary kind of metric of success, Bravo, a carbon negative country. And so we have one country, but we do not celebrate and measure what's good, and we are investing more energy and money in punishment and blame than we are in restitution. So if someone murders a member of your family, so great, they were put into a concrete box, and for the next 25 years, the taxpayer paid $2.5 million to put that person in a concrete box, and you're still missing your loved one. Does that make sense? What about $2.5 million going to your family? or what about that person dedicating their life to honoring some of the positive attributes of your lost family member? If your family member was, passionate about children's safety, or loved plants and gardens, etc. In other words, what about looking at the ability of the individual who caused the harm to contribute positive value to those that were harmed? And there's a number of different parts of this that are profoundly beneficial. So the first thing is they're not in a concrete box costing everyone $100,000 a year. That's a definite win. The second thing is that if you've killed someone, for example, and you're in jail and you have a shred of human decency, meaning you're not traumatized to such an extent that you can't leave the reptilian brain. If you can go up into the rational and empathic regions of the brain, which every human being can, unless they've been severely abused to a point where their reptilian brain overrides all other brain functions because the environment has been so sociopathic for them in early formative years that the reptilian brain views itself as necessary to survive in a reptilian environment. The more sociopathic the environment, the more active the reptilian brainstem. And the more active the reptilian brainstem, the less empathy and the more fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are positions out of which expedient crimes can be committed. And if someone is in a traumatized, fear-based state, later when they emerge into reason and empathy in the higher functions of the brain, they feel remorse for the impact they've had on other people. Well, if you feel tremendous remorse about the impact you have on other people, and let's face it, you're not rehabilitated unless you've moved from the reptilian brain function towards the empathic brain function. You are a reptile if you are primarily operating out of the reptilian brain, and the reptile has no morals. The reptile is fear and survival based, and it will use fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, ass kissing, without morals or compunction, to do what is expedient. So if you want to bring someone back into the community, you've got to engage the empathic center of the brain, which means they've got to forgive themselves for becoming reptiles. And they've also got to forgive the community around them for triggering that degree of reptilian energy. Because infants are not born reptiles. An infant has to be born into a severely traumatic and sociopathic environment without repair for that infant to grow into usually a young adult or teenager or grown-up. That is in effect a sociopath because there's so much pain directed towards them that their empathic brain has failed to develop or shut off, dissociated, and what remains is the reptilian brainstem. So to a certain extent, we are being punished by the criminals we create through an absence of competent parenting and education. We'll see parenting and education. So in that sense, we're getting payback. And to some extent, it's unfair to punish those we have already punished to such an extent that they are literally trapped within their reptilian brainstem. However, the migration from reptile to empath, which can take place in time, goes much easier if the person can look at themselves and say that I made a valuable contribution rather than I was a burden to society. But we are mandating by law that they are and will be a burden to society. Because, first of all, we're raising them to be reptilian, which is a burden to society. Secondly, they're committing a violation, which is a burden to society. And then we are mandating that by law they become a burden to society for X number of years. And there's nowhere in there to say, wow, I made a positive difference. You look at your life and you say, the world would be a better place if I didn't exist. And so you self-harm. And thus you deteriorate, and that ripples outward and affects other people. So if you mandate a remedial program where the goal is to have 3 times the positive impact that you had negative impact, now you get a number of benefits. First of all, you get liquidity of value to pay for a justice system, because it takes money to research what actually happened. There's an investment. Secondly, the person learns to contribute value. And if they succeed, will have a lot easier time forgiving themselves for the crime. They will say, not just I sat in a box for 10 years wasting taxpayer money. Big deal. You know, how does that offset causing problems before? You stole a candy bar that cost $10, and for this you were prescribed 2 years at $200,000 to repair that damage. Seem a little crazy? Of course it is. It's absurd. It's like saying you had the audacity to have one infected finger, let's cut your hand off, and call that a cure. It's pathetic. So the shift towards like a 3-to-1 return, this becomes a deterrent. Because it's going to take time and money and energy to research a crime and catch it. So if the goal is we assess the negative impact you have had, and we direct positive impact to offset that for the people you had that negative impact with. And this can be done in a variety of different ways. Prevention is one of the best things. So, for example, if you have negative impact let's say you molest a child. Well, it's very difficult to repair that amount of damage, particularly in a shame-based culture. But if you study psychology and understand the core dynamics that produce pedophiles, some cultures produce a lot more pedophiles than others. That's a cultural thing to study. Secondly, the abuse patterns of the victim and how in shame-based cultures victims hide for fear of being shamed. And again, in other healthier cultures come forward. This education, this cultural reform, and the focus on prevention with a data-based system of what works can lead to where the problem becomes the cure. And that's really what you want to do if you want a sustainable relationship with anything. You need to turn what was your problem into your solution. So problems into solutions, punishment into remediation, medicine, and repair. Prevention, taking the form of eliminating all laws that do not, at a present-day time, create more well-being than if the law doesn't exist. So my belief is that laws are themselves the creation of many criminals. In fact, in the United States today, with the amount of laws on the book, it's pretty much guaranteed, meaning 99% of Americans are criminals. 99% of Americans are not willfully hurting other people. 99% of Americans are not accidentally hurting other people. But 99.9% of Americans are criminals on a yearly basis. From traffic infractions to, late to renew the driver's license, to late to the smog test, to late on taxes, to missing this tax line item, to miscategorizing this, to not doing the right amount of. So 99.9% of Americans are criminals because of the poorly written and excessive amounts of laws that criminalize the population. And of those, 2% are involved in the criminal justice system. So asking, I think that as a matter of course, that 100 people have to vouch for every law for it to stay on the books for the next year. That if there are not 100 people that care about that law, it vanishes. So if there's some law that you like, and an app can track a red list of all the laws that are going to expire if there isn't 100 people, and some laws can be given like a 10-year span, and some can be given a yearly span. But every law should have an expiration date, and depending on its significance and its impact, and its complexity, etc. They might have a 5-year, a 10-year, a 20-year, a 1-year expiration date. But if you can't find 100 people that are passionate about that law existing, or if a large percentage of people want to vote against it, so if you've got no activity, it just expires. If it's got 100 people for it and nobody protesting, it can stay in. If 90% or more of people protest a law as causing more damage than good, it should expire. Because we're not saying people can't do whatever they think are the right thing just because the law doesn't exist. We're just saying we're not going to put our people in concrete boxes and tie up large amounts of resources to punish them. So community service, and particularly service towards the victim of abuse, is the pinnacle of justice. See, we have it like if you're a really hardcore criminal, you're going to be put in a box. But if you get off easy, we'll let you do community service. It should be the opposite. And so the exceptions are violent human beings that we lack the intelligence to heal. Violence is a disease, according to Gary Slutkin, an epidemiologist, and is best treated as a disease. And if we lack the competency to heal the disease and prefer instead to cause mutual suffering at $100,000 a year, certainly there are cases where that is the case. But the combination of social media ranking, and I think this should also be an offset type of thing, so that, for example, if you commit a crime, let's say you kill a child at a crosswalk. A child was walking over, you didn't see them, you drove into them, and so you get a huge, loss. You've had a tremendous amount of harm on a family. So your social credit score, goes to zero. That record doesn't go away. But if you help several homeless people, donate to a children's shelter, support that family through a grieving process, pay for the therapy, whatever, there should be a way to build that back so that that there is a healthy place to allocate, that there's a way for everyone to win, basically, at improving their lives and mitigating their unconsciousness or, their negative impact. So that your record can be, your social rank, so to speak, can be a measure of the net well-being that you share and give to the community. So that you're not a prisoner to one mistaken blind spot, for the rest of your life. But that you have a basis to re-earn self-respect and respect for the community that is constructive. So, eliminating many unnecessary laws, a positive investment in every African American child that is statistically correlated. And one little adjunct to this is I would do a magazine or a website as part of this program where you have success stories and failure stories. Here's a story of someone that took this $50,000. They did, $10,000 in learning a trade, apprenticing, this and that and the other. They bought capital and did this and that and opened this business, and now their business is worth $250,000. And so there's a success story. And a failure story. Here's another person who took the money and they got the shop front, but then they hired their friend for the employee who didn't show up on time, and and they went bankrupt, a couple of years later. So that you have stories of what works and stories of what doesn't work. But a positive investment that someone in a neighborhood with high crime and addictive drugs, etc., absolutely has a guaranteed ticket out of there if they know what they're doing, because that eliminates hopelessness, that reduces addiction, etc. The next thing to look at is that addiction is a pain management disease, not a crime. Portugal has demonstrated conclusively that decriminalizing all drugs and putting that money into a series of clinics where you can A, safely do drugs, B, get help for drugs, 3, educate people about drugs, and get safe needles and this, that, and the other, that you dramatically reduce the harm of drugs. You dramatically reduce the cost of the war on human beings, because we have millions of Americans, for example, in the criminal justice system for nonviolent use of marijuana. Absolutely insane. So, taking medical issues out of the criminal justice system and applying them in a paradigm of medicine, health, and well-being takes about a third of the issues out of the quote justice system. And it's also very important to understand that banned substances of any kind, prohibition in the United States created the mafia. So speakeasies went through the roof. So there were more illegal businesses than there were illegal bars by the end of Prohibition. The mafia had been created, the criminal underclass had been created and highly funded, and no one paid any taxes. That's the result of banning any substance. Every substance that someone wants to consume should be legally available and taxed at a rate that allows for education and also medical treatment if the substance has a danger around it. And this I think this taxing at the level of production, to where a factory producing a very toxic chemical that was leading to a certain number of fatalities and fires or whatever it was, would pay a tax to pay the cost of remediating the harmful effects of that chemical, to incentivize companies to minimize the danger of the products they produce. So getting substances out of the justice system, we'll talk about that more on the war on drugs, and taxing every substance, which generates revenues rather than costing revenues. Because when you make a substance illegal, like marijuana, you're spending public money to hunt people consuming marijuana, and you're getting no money coming in because you can't tax something that you've banned and made illegal.